The daughters of George III. George III was King of Great Britain and Ireland and King of Hanover from 1760 to 1820. His marriage to Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz resulted in the births of 15 children, more children than most of his predecessors and descendants would have. This video will dive into the lives of his 6 daughters who led very isolated childhoods and lives under their parents' care. Charlotte, Princess Royal, was the eldest daughter of George III. She was born on the 29th of September 1766. Her parents had only sons by this point, and when she was born, they were delighted to have a daughter for once. Like all her siblings, Charlotte was inoculated against smallpox in 1768. As the eldest daughter of the monarch, it was assumed by most that Charlotte would marry someone important, and her education was considered to be of the utmost importance. She started her formal education at only 18 months old, learning languages, history, geography, music, art, needlework, and spinning. Her parents loved to show off their children, and when she was 3 years old, Charlotte took part in her first tableau, where she danced with her older brother George. They continued to show off their children, which made Charlotte very uncomfortable. After a bad event where a hearse was driven into the palace courtyard, the king and queen decided to never repeat the experience. Charlotte grew up under a strict regime imposed by her mother. She woke up early, ate plain food, and was never let out of her parents' sight. Court life was monotonous. The monotony was interspersed with outings to places like the Royal Academy, Oxford University, and Egham races. They sometimes watched plays or listened to musical concerts at home or at the theatre. Charlotte was shy and lacked confidence. As the oldest, her mother expected her to be responsible for her younger sisters. This made her unpopular with them, as she was inclined to make up stories about them to her parents. She was insecure and hated being teased. She felt her parents did not love her as much as her other siblings. She felt like a slave rather than a daughter and grew increasingly bitter over her mother. The princesses were rarely allowed to interact with members of the opposite sex. They felt it was more of a nunnery than a palace, and all of them yearned for freedom. When Charlotte was young, the family was small and her parents got to spend more time with each of her siblings. However, the family soon grew and her father suffered from deteriorating mental health. Her childhood was not as utopian as her parents had wished for her. On the 18th of May 1797, Charlotte was wed to Frederick, hereditary Prince of Württemberg. In December of that year, Frederick became the Duke of Württemberg. Frederick and Charlotte had one stillborn daughter together. After the French army occupied Württemberg in 1800, the Duke and Duchess fled to Austria. In 1801, Frederick concluded a treaty with France, and they returned to Württemberg. He also became the Elector of Württemberg in 1803. In exchange for providing France with a large armed force, Napoleon, the Emperor of the French, recognized Frederick as the King of Württemberg in 1805, and he assumed his throne on the 1st of January 1806. Frederick's joining of the Confederation of the Rhine made Frederick enemy of his father-in-law, George III. Incensed by his son-in-law's assumption of the title of king, George refused to address his daughter as Queen of Württemberg. In 1813, Frederick changed sides and went over to the Allies. In 1816, Frederick attended the Congress of Vienna, where he was confirmed as the king. He died in October of that year. After the death of her husband, Charlotte continued to live at Ludwigsburg Palace, and in 1819 she became a godmother of her niece Princess Victoria of Kent, the future Queen Victoria. In 1827, Charlotte returned to England to have surgery for dropsy. While in London, Charlotte lived in St. James's Palace and made visits to her family. She returned to Württemberg in October 1827 and passed away a year later on the 6th of October 1828. Princess Augusta Sophia was the sixth child of George III and Queen Charlotte, and their second daughter. She was born on the 8th of November 1768 in Buckingham House. Like all of her siblings, she was inoculated against smallpox. Augusta and her sisters were educated at home, under their mother's watchful eye, by governesses and tutors. They received an education in languages, history, geography, music, art, needlework and spinning. Augusta was lively and extroverted. She was energetic and loved to play cricket and football with her brothers. She was charming, genuine and humorous. The princesses were rarely allowed to interact with members of the opposite sex. What made matters worse was that their father limited their prospects by not allowing them to marry either Catholics nor commoners. The king found fault with any suitor brought forward for Augusta. It came to light that he did not want his younger daughters to marry before their elder sister Charlotte had. When Charlotte finally married in 1797, Augusta was almost 30 years old. Due to the lack of opportunity to form an acceptable marriage, Augusta found love elsewhere. She was attracted to Henry Vaughan, one of her father's doctors, which lasted some time before she formed a long-lasting relationship to Lieutenant General Sir Brent Spencer. She told her brother George about their relationship, and when he became Prince Regent, she requested his approval. She knew it would have to be private, as her mother did not approve of the match. It is possible that they got married, but it was never acknowledged. As Augusta and her sisters became older, their relationship with their mother became strained. They wanted freedom, but their mother accused them of being unloving and uncaring about their sick father. Their eldest brother George did what he could to restore peace and give his sisters more freedom, whom he adored. Her brother ascended the throne as George IV in 1820. Augusta presided over drawing rooms for her brother and fulfilled the role of hostess, left empty by his estranged wife Caroline. Augusta disliked George's mistress, Lady Conyngham, and refused to act as hostess in her presence. After the death of her father, Augusta moved into Frogmore House, which was left to her by Queen Charlotte. She became a companion for her older brother William IV's widow, Adelaide, in her early years of widowhood. Augusta passed away on the 22nd of September 1840. Princess Elizabeth was the third daughter and seventh child born to George III and Queen Charlotte. She was born on the 22nd of May 1770 and was inoculated against smallpox like her siblings. Like her sisters, Elizabeth received her education at home and received a good education. She loved music and was a gifted artist. The princesses received little freedom, and their mother restricted their every move, from what they could read to who they could talk to. Aside from the occasional outing to the theatre, the races, or visiting towns, the princesses lived a life of monotony. In 1785, Elizabeth had her coming out ball. Her dress was similar of that to her older sisters, which indicated a lack of individuality between the princesses. She walked a minuet with Lord Rochford at the ball. Elizabeth suffered from poor health and became overweight as she got older. As a result, her sisters nicknamed her Fatima. She was very sensitive and emotional. Elizabeth hoped she would marry one day and have children of her own. She drank sugar melted in water at night in the hopes that it would give her a sweet temperament, and took long walks to prevent herself from getting too overweight. She kept herself occupied, writing her mother's letters, collecting porcelain, and keeping pigs at Frogmore. Because she had no children of her own, Elizabeth looked after other people's children and devoted herself to children's charities. In 1808, the future King Louis Philippe proposed to the princess, which she wanted to accept. However, her mother refused the match due to him not being wealthy and a Catholic. Elizabeth eventually married Frederick, Landgrave of Hesse-Homburg, in 1818. She had been writing to him for 2 years. The Queen initially seemed okay with the match, but when she realised that Elizabeth would no longer be around, Charlotte acted out, refusing to agree to the match. This greatly distressed Elizabeth, and she was forced to assure her mother that she would remain in England for a while after the wedding. Frederick and Elizabeth were married on the 7th of April 1818 at Buckingham House. They honeymooned at the Royal Lodge in Windsor and spent 2 months in England. In June, they travelled to Frankfurt. Though it's not clear whether the marriage was a love match, it does appear to have been a great success. They seemed genuinely fond of each other. Unsurprisingly, their marriage produced no children. After her husband's death in 1829, Elizabeth divided her time between Homburg and Hanover. She also visited England occasionally. She died in Frankfurt am Main on the 10th of January 1840 at the age of 69. Princess Mary was born on the 25th of April 1776 and was the 11th child and 4th daughter of George III and Queen Charlotte. Mary was educated by governesses at home. She was taught languages, art, needlework and music, something Mary was skilled at. She and her sisters were given very little freedom and were restricted by their parents in what they were allowed to do. They lived very monotonous lives, which was interrupted only occasionally by an outing to the theatre or to a neighbouring town. On the 2nd of June 1788, Mary and her sisters attended a gala at Ranelagh held by the Spanish ambassador. It was very entertaining for her, and amusements included a lottery, dancing and fireworks. Mary attended court for the first time in June 1791, and her cousin Prince William of Gloucester also made his first appearance. Mary and her family would visit Weymouth every summer from 1789 until 1805. They would swim at sea and ride donkeys. They would attend public breakfasts held by a local dignitary or go carriage riding. When it rained, they were confined indoors with nothing to do with too little space. During her sister Amelia's bout of tuberculosis, the princesses spent time in Weymouth. Mary was her sister's nurse and they became close companions. Mary was kind and affectionate and was her eldest brother George's favourite sister. She was described by Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the husband of Queen Victoria, as being a lady whose virtues and qualities of the heart had commanded the respect and love of all who knew her. Mary was more discreet than her sisters, but spoke her mind when necessary. On the 22nd of July 1816, Mary married William, Duke of Gloucester, her cousin. They moved into Bagshot Park. They had no children, but they had a loving marriage. They adored each other and remained constant companions. In 1834, the Duke died and Mary moved into Gloucester House. She was the last and longest surviving child of George III, and the only one of her siblings to be photographed. She passed away on the 30th of April 1857 at the age of 81. She was seen by her nieces and nephews as a sort of grandmother and a link to their grandfather and grandmother who had passed away when many of them were still very young. Princess Sophia was the 12th child of George III and Queen Charlotte. She was born on the 3rd of November 1777 at Windsor Castle. Like her sisters, she received an education at home under the supervision of governesses and was given very little freedom. Sophia was a passionate woman inclined to be quite moody. She was the favourite sister of both the Duke of Clarence and the Duke of Kent. They often called her their dear little angel. Sophia's parents were fond of their daughters and were in no hurry to allow them to grow up and leave the home. Sophia and her sisters had to wait until their eldest sister Charlotte found a match before they could marry themselves, which was customary at the time. When she finally married in 1797, matches were not forthcoming for the other princesses. Perhaps if the king had remained well enough, he may have secured suitable marriages for all his daughters, but due to his deteriorating mental health, their situation was left in limbo. Sophia was not happy with her situation. She received one offer of marriage from a German prince in 1801, but her parents turned the offer down as they found him unacceptable, and she never married. Sophia did find love in life. She fell in love with one of the few gentlemen she was allowed to meet, called General Thomas Garth. He was one of the king's equerries and was 30 years her senior. There were rumours of the two marrying, but they never lived together, so it remains uncertain of whether this is true. However, there is evidence of Sophia having had an illegitimate son born in August 1800 in Weymouth, the seaside town where Sophia and her family would visit. Garth and Sophia had an opportunity to be alone together one evening while her parents were in London. 9 months later, Sophia was brought to bed, according to Lady Bath. Lady Bath had heard the news from Lady Caroline Thynne, who was mistress of the robes to the Queen and would have been in a position to have known the truth. Fearing that the news would distress the king was told Sophia had dropsy, which was supposedly cured by eating roast beef. As the king was almost completely blind by this time and was unaware of the real state of affairs, he seemed to have accepted it as the truth. The boy was christened Thomas and was left with Major Herbert Taylor, the private secretary of the Duke of York. Garth accepted Thomas as his son and was promoted in court, obtaining a position in Princess Charlotte of Wales' household. Sophia would occasionally visit baby Thomas. An alternative story arose in which the father of the baby was Sophia's brother Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, who always had an unnatural interest in his sister. However, this was probably false. Throughout her life, Sophia suffered from spasms and depression, and as she grew older, she was forced to spend more time in bed to recover. After her mother died in 1818, Sophia inherited the lower lodge at Windsor, but chose to live in Kensington Palace, near her niece Princess Victoria. Sophia and Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, fell under the influence of John Conroy, both being charmed by his easy confidence. Conroy took control of her finances, and she helped him gain the title of Knight Commander of the Hanoverian Order. Conroy's influence over her alienated her from her niece Victoria, who despised Conroy. Sophia lived to the age of 70, passing away on the 27th of May, 1848. The youngest of the daughters and children of George III and Queen Charlotte, Princess Amelia was born the 7th of August, 1783 in Windsor. She was born after the tragic deaths of her older brothers Alfred and Octavius, and she soon became her father's favourite child. As a young child, the king would often sit with the princess on the carpet of the nursery and play with her. Amelia grew into a graceful, beautiful woman. Her education was supervised by governesses, and she grew into quite the accomplished young woman in music, art, and needlework. She was talented at the piano and skilled at riding. Amelia's health was never robust, and in 1798 she contracted tuberculosis. By 18, she also suffered from St. Anthony's fire, a painful bacterial skin infection. To help her health, she spent time in Worthing, a seaside town. Her oldest brother George would often visit her, and they became quite close. His visits helped boost her spirit. In 1799, she recovered somewhat, and celebrations were held in Frogmore. However, her good health did not last long. By the summer, she was unable to walk for long periods of time. She stayed in Gloucester Lodge, played music, and entertained her young niece Charlotte. Bathing in salt water helped her to feel better. In 1801, Amelia fell in love with Colonel Charles Fitzroy, one of her father's equerries. He was a descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II, and George III adored him, referring to him as Prince Charles in court. Amelia desired to marry him and tried to get support from her mother, who was against the match. Amelia never forgave her mother for this, and Amelia considered herself to be married already and began to sign her letters as AFR, Amelia Fitzroy, from 1804. Amelia's health began to fail, and she returned to Weymouth in 1808 with her sister Mary, her faithful and devoted companion. Once she realised she was dying, she had a ring made for her father, inscribed with the words, "Remember me." When her father came to visit her, she placed the ring on his finger and he burst into tears. She left everything to Fitzroy. George, her brother, persuaded Fitzroy to renounce his claim to her belongings, and everything was given to Mary instead. On the 2nd of November, 1810, Princess Amelia died at Augusta Lodge in Windsor. The king never recovered and he was plunged into derangement. The 6 daughters of George III led quiet lives that they did not desire. They longed for adventure and freedom from their parents. Against their parents' wishes, many of the princesses led scandalous secret lives with secret lovers, and only after their parents' deaths did the princesses truly become free.